by introducing Dr. Catherine Bateson, who is an associate lecturer in American history at the University of Kent. She researches and teaches the American Civil War, 1700s to early 1900s, US social and cultural topics, slavery, civil rights and indigenous history, and American studies. She published Irish American Civil War songs, Identity, Loyalty, and Nationhood, and has also written articles about the Irish American wartime experience and the importance of music in military history. She has 2 chapters on retreat in Irish American Civil War songs and on Irish American enemy encounters in Union and Confederate stories, forthcoming in 2023. Catherine is currently working on a new project in about the 25th anniversary of the American Civil War. She's also associate editor in the Irish American Civil War Project and co-founder of the Stuff of War Society. Today, Catherine will talk with us about not only about the inspirational book and research, but also about her experiences in publishing her book, as it is a major topic for a lot of us, considering we are a postgraduate and early career researchers audience. Thank you, and the floor is yours, Catherine.
Thank you very much, Aya, and thank you very much to USSO. I've just realized as you were talking, the very first thing I ever wrote as a PhD student was a book review for the USSO site. So I feel like I've now just gone, we were talking about this before about going full circle. I've now gone really full circle now that now I'm actually going to talk about my book. Which is
coming back home, yeah.
Exactly. I've always loved the site. So yes, I'm going to talk about this lovely book here, my book, Irish American Civil War Songs, Identity, Loyalty, and Nationhood. I'm going to talk about the kind of context of the book, give you a few examples of some of the songs before saving some time to talk about the wider publishing experience of what's been a journey. Let's put it that way, as a kind of spoiler. I'm just going to quickly share my screen for the PowerPoint, and hopefully can everyone see that? Good. Excellent. So yes, I began this book originally back as a PhD project back in, I started at Edinburgh in September of 2014, but the original origins of this book actually stemmed from during my master's thesis when I was, well, actually not even my thesis, I was doing my MA in American Studies at King's College London, back when they used to do an MA in American Studies. And as part of it, I did an internship with the British Library's Americas collection. It was part of one of the module components. And it was back in 2013, so around the kind of middle point of the sesquicentennial, so the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. And the library were very keen to put up an online gallery exhibition of some of their digitized content relating to Britain and the American Civil War. And the website is, those pages are still up there on the BL website. I've got to point out that I've already spotted about 5 errors in the year since that I accidentally put in. But one of the things that they had digitized and I was putting up examples of for the public to see was a collection of songs. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples of these actually in a minute on the side. And the first one, although it took me 2 years to realize that the first one was connected to the Irish, but there are about 13 in this collection of 240 odd relating to the Irish experience. And I was there finishing my MA, doing this internship, thinking about doing a PhD, and it's as if the PhD project slightly fell into the lap, because like I need to think about what to do as a PhD topic. I knew I wanted to be Civil War-y, but I also knew at that point nothing about the Irish American experience of the Civil War. So that's where the PhD started. So that does mean, and I can't believe I'm about to say this, in about May, this project will be 10 years old, which is really terrifying as an idea. But yes, effectively, it then became the PhD project. And then with not a huge amount, although there was some, and I'm like preempt a few questions later on about how much was changed for the book, it then became the book that was published at the end of September of last year. So this gives you a bit of an idea of the layout of the book. This is its contents, and the big shout out quickly to the beautiful art department at LSU who created this fantastic internal cover, and also the covering design too. And the illustration actually comes from song sheets from the period as well. So it's all in keeping in theme. So the book's contents is laid out there. So the first couple are kind of the bigger introductories, which actually, if you think about churning it from a PhD, in the original PhD, chapters 1 and 2 were actually together as a kind of mega context section. after the introduction, before moving on to the, it's broken up thematically and also unintentionally chronologically, because the themes keep changing through the book. So it starts with this kind of big context about the wider history of Irish songs and music in 19th century America before, so about the publication of how Civil War songs about the Irish were spread around, and then talking about the major themes. So dealing with songs that talked about the wartime service. The lyrical cultural identity chapter is about the connection to Irish heritage and Irish military history that the songs sing about. Chapter 5 relates to sentiments of Irish nationalism and the desire to go fight for an independent Ireland against the British in the aftermath of the Civil War, and how some of that nationalism, which actually really gets going kind of after the Civil War, but how it has roots in the Civil War period too. Chapter 6 is one which deals with the more slightly familiar areas of Irish American Civil War history, actually Irish American 19th century history, that some of you listening may know of already, which is things like the draft riots in 1863 and Irish American hostility in some sections. The chapter kind of explains how this was very much a minority. In some sections, the kind of hostility towards emancipation and dealing with African American freedom. And then the kind of concluding last 7th chapter is an amalgamation of all of this with the 1864 election, and then also how much America comes to the fore. And I suppose this is a big spoiler for the main thesis of the book, but I'll get it out of the way because it will be the running theme of the talk. It's just basically that the Irish really sing a lot about their American identity as much as they're Irish. In fact, if anything, more so during the Civil War, but it reveals the fact that they had become quite Americanized by the 1860s. And so the songs are reflective of that. Before I go any further, I should give some statistics. This is the only statistics part of the talk, but to put it into context. So during the American Civil War between 1861 and 1865, it's estimated that around 200,000 Irish born, and then an even greater number of 2nd, 3rd, 4th generation descended Irish soldiers and sailors fought in the war. So what I mean about descended, I mean those who've got parents who were born in Ireland or a grandparent born in Ireland and so on and so forth. A huge number were originally born in Ireland though and had come over to America, a lot of them in the 1840s and 1850s as a result of the Great Famine, but also kind of migration all the way through to the 1860s. And the vast majority, about 180,000, even up to 200,000 of those were fighting for the Union, reflective of the fact that the majority of Irish immigrants were in the urban northern enclaves of New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, and so on and so forth, but also spread out through Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, and Illinois. And then there are about 20,000, it's thought, Irish born who fought for the Confederacy. And although a lot of the book talks about Union examples, and I'm probably going to be, actually no, I am going to be talking about just Union examples today, there are a handful of specific Irish Confederate songs that were written and published, and I also talk about those in the book. But rather than having, this was a big dilemma about where they fit in the book, whether to have a whole chapter on them or weave them through, those Confederate songs kind of weave through as little counterpoints to some of the main narrative that forms. It stands to reason there are more songs about the Irish in the Union, just because the sheer number of size, we're talking about well over 1.5 million or so by the middle of the 19th century, mostly in the northern states. So that's the kind of layout of the book and so on. It deals with the fact that they are American Irish in many ways, with the way in which they kind of deal with all of these things, including their own Irish heritage and Irish nationalism. So the next slide. Oh yeah, too far. So the origins of Irish music in America and how a lot of this is actually disseminated into the American populace in the 19th century come in the form of what you can see on the left of that image, which is Thomas More's Irish Melodies, which was a hugely popular book of songs, a collection of songs published in the early 1800s. Moore is seen as one of the kind of foremost writers and kind of fixers of Irish music, in terms of the fact that he put down quite a lot of stuff on paper that has then kind of run through Irish now traditional folk music and culture from the early 1800s too. He is basically to Ireland's music what Robert Burns is to Scotland's poems in the 19th century. And in fact, it would not be uncommon to walk into a middle-class house and see Thomas More's Irish Melodies and Robert Burns's books side by side to each other. This book on the left is a collection actually printed much later in the 20th century, early 20th century, but some of these would just have the lyrics and some would have the notations and the music. I'm going to talk a little bit about the notation music later on in this talk. But the thing to bear in mind is that in the 19th century, you're dealing with an incredibly musically literate society. So it's hard to say that people would just know these tunes, but they would. They are regularly performing them, they're singing them in parlors, they're singing them in drinking halls, on the music hall stage, and so there's a kind of culture of music and song singing that immigrants, not just the Irish, other British Isles immigrants and also German and European immigrants are bringing over with them through their migration, and these are suffusing into American music culture. In fact, a lot of 19th century American music culture has its roots in things that have come from across the Atlantic. So the best example that I often use, and some of you who've heard me talk before may know I've always gone about this, is the Star Spangled Banner. So the tune to Francis Scott Key's poem, so the tune of the American anthem, is actually a 1790s English drinking song that was then re-established. I find it deeply ironic, America sing an anthem that's actually younger than the country and it comes from England, but that's a whole other talk. Also, there's a song very popular in the Confederacy during the war called Maryland, My Maryland, which is also still the state song of Maryland. And we'd all be able to sing it, except I wouldn't recommend it. It's very pro-Confederate, which is set to the same tune as O Christmas Tree, or for those of you who know it, also is the Red Flag. It's that same tune. Now that's actually a 15th century German tune. So in the book I differentiate, and I've seen a couple of reviewers miss this point, but there is a difference between music, which is actually the tunes, and the actual kind of the lyric, the ballad tune and the kind of the musical notations, and then the songs, which are actually the lyrics, and musicologists differentiate between the two. And so we might get into this in the questions, this is very much an interdisciplinary book in that it's about Irish Americans and it's about American song culture, but it's also dealing with elements of musicology as well, and that differentiation between the fact that you've got tunes that have very, very old histories, pre-19th century. Lots of Irish tunes are like this, they're often 17th century tunes, and then the songs which are written in the 19th century as well. And so through particularly, not just because of the famine, but certainly by the 1850s, there are a lot of Irish traditional songs floating around America, and a lot of American music is actually using tunes that are Irish. It's said, this is slightly inaccurate, that there are about 12 to 15 Irish tunes, and that everything in traditional music is a variation on that theme. And certainly there are some that when I had the lyrics, I was able to kind of go, right, I'm going to pick this tune and see if it works. And I spent many days during the PhD trying to match up lyrics to tunes, because often the song sheets and the song books don't have the tunes in them, because this goes back to the musical literacy. People would just know, or would be able to make up the tunes for them. The image on the right, I love this image. This was originally going to be a book cover image, but it's not brilliant when it comes to high definition. This is how a lot of songs were also spread around the American Civil War. So they're printed on song sheets, which you're going to see lots of examples on for the rest of the slides, and they're printed in these songster books. So the songsters are collections of just pretty much just the lyrics of songs too. And this book, The Campfire Songster, was full of lots of Union songs written by the middle of the war, of which Irish ones were in there, or the Irish appear in verses of certain general songs as well. And I love this image of the soldiers kind of gathering around the campfire, because actually that's a lot of how music and music playing, because they brought instruments to the front lines into the camps, and song sharing went on. And I've got stories in the book about kind of soldiers copying each other's music, or asking for sheet music to be sent to them, and that they've learned a new tune, and they tell their parents very proudly that they've learned these tunes. sometimes they're actually learning Irish songs for the first time through their brethren at the front line rather than in their family settings at home too. So it's a good kind of image to encapsulate that mentality and spirit. These, though, are the song sheets that I'm referring to. These are just a couple of examples. There are many. The book has, well, for the book I had about 150 to 200 different verses and songs that were kind of disseminated into what goes into the book. So here, the middle image and the one on the left, there are two different versions of it, of the Gallant Sons of Erin, which is quite an early wartime song. It's one of the first that are written about the Irish experience. So the Irish in the Northern Union Army can be broken down into different experiences, but the ones that keep coming up and the ones who get sung about the most are a group called the Irish Brigade, who were formed at the end of 1861, early 1862, originally and eventually comprised of 3 regiments from New York, 1 regiment from Massachusetts and 1 from Pennsylvania. I had to learn a lot of military history when I'm not a military historian, I'm a cultural military historian now. So I had to learn about all the difference between regiments and militias. And these examples of Gallant Sons of Erin are the New York State Militia, who are the 69th New York State Militia, who go on to form the kind of founding regiment eventually then of the Irish Brigade. And there are more songs about other groups, but often what happens is that the Irish Brigade and the 69th New York appear in lots of songs in the war because they become kind of de facto catch points that everyone is familiar with because they're learning the stories of their war service through songs like this. And through some wartime publications, some of their generals write little wartime biographies during the conflict before it's finished. And they kind of come to be a kind of catch-all. So you can exchange, and I'm going to talk about one of these in a bit, you can exchange a song about the 69th New York State Regiment for a different regiment or militia later on in the war. But the Gallant Sons of Erin in particular deals with the early days of the 69th New York State Militia, when they are formed initially in response to Lincoln's call for troops very early on by May 1861, so not long after the firing on Fort Sumter at the start of the American Civil War. And it talks about the fact that they are going to the war and that they have gone to fight. And it mentions how at famed Manassas and Bull Run, where glorious laurels they had won. So this is an early song that's written in the summer of 1861, just after the first Battle of Bull Run, the first battle of the war. And so it's getting their kind of story about what they did on that battlefield out there to the American public, and kind of singing about the fact that they're already really brave and they've already proven their worth, and they're going to keep on doing so for the country. And these early songs, and actually almost all of these songs, start in quite traditional folk song way. In other words, kind of gathering people around. This is going to be a story. These are still songs that are slightly representative of broadside balladry. In other words, that the song sheets and song performance is also a way of telling the news. So in some ways, this is like watching News 24, but on a kind of singing form, or watching Twitter through a lyric effectively. And so these kind of song examples are good of that. Same with the other example on the right of the screen, the Harp of Old Erin and Banner of Stars. Similarly dedicated and kind of talking about the first few days of the war and also how they're going to fight for the Union together, and about the kind of coming together of the Irish inside the US Federal Army. And the singing about these different militias and their regiments, and these Irish run and ethnically Irish regiments and organizations form then quite a lot of the songs all the way up to about 1864 or so. And so I've just put a few kind of title examples on the left of that screen. So you've got songs that kind of sing about the gallant 69th or the glorious 69th, that are interchangeable. And then the top two bottom images, so the Battle of Bull Run or the Lamentation on the American War, Awful Battle of Vicksburg, are songs that not only sing about the actual kind of regiments themselves and their leaders, but also the battles that they fought at. And again, talking about their service. A Lamentation on the American War is interesting in two ways. First of all, it's the only one that actually sings directly about both Union Irish and Confederate Irish fighting against each other. And second, it's actually published in Ireland. So some of the songs in the book also detail songs that were written in Ireland and were kind of following the news of the war back. And so these ones are great because they're full of detail that are actually not right, that the news hadn't caught up. So some of the songs report deaths of generals that hadn't happened, or they're still kind of, they're slightly behind, but it shows the fact that these are not just in isolation. This is a transnational story of service, and they're not just fighting and sung about in America. Also, A Lamentation on the American War contains a beautiful stanza about mothers running to the local post office to wait for news of hearing about their sons in Ireland and whether they've survived or not. And it's just a very, very heartfelt moment. I'm just going to take a quick opportunity to slightly plug another publication because it only came out 2 weeks ago, and in the current climate, it's been quite hard to plug this. But the image you can see on the right, this is a book that's just come out 2 weeks ago called Armies in Retreat by Army University Press. And I have a chapter in that, the reason I put it up there, which goes into a bit more detail about how the Irish sung about the Battle of Bull Run, the first Bull Run, and the fact that it's a failure. It's a total failure for the Union, the first Bull Run, and it's a very, very inglorious retreat, except if you listened to Irish songs at the time that came out, you'd think that they'd won because they turned the retreat into a victory, because they basically stay on the field for as long as possible and form these very glorious and inspiring rearguard retreats. And so the chapter goes into much more detail with kind of more examples and connection to the military history that I couldn't do in the book. And it came out 2 weeks ago. And if you go on the Army and University Press site, you can actually get the whole PDF book free. There's like 20 odd chapters of different conflicts. There's a couple of other Civil War ones. There's some other American ones. It's really for the military people, but also it's got some interesting kind of cultural kind of consequences, which of what my chapter is a part of. So I'm just going to plug that one too. It goes into more detail about this kind of battlefield balladry concept of victory. One of the things, speaking of the battles, other things that get sung about quite a lot are sort of touchstones of exemplar service for the Irish to emulate are songs about particular Irish leaders. So the guy on the horse there pointing his sword on the kind of semi to the left of the screen is General Michael Corcoran. At this point, he's Colonel Michael Corcoran of the 69th New York State Militia. He's their leader, and he is captured at the First Battle of Bull Run. He gives himself up effectively and then goes to prison in various Confederate prison holdings for a staggering 13 months, which early on in the war is quite rare, but it's just because he refuses to take oaths. He wants to fight, so he's going to do everything he can, or did everything he can to make sure he gets returned to the North, which he eventually is. And in fact, actually, the book's title cover image comes from one of the holdings in South Carolina in the harbor at Charleston, where Corcoran was also held. And the reason it's that image is partly because it connects to Corcoran, but also because in the background of the photo, and I'll put the cover up again in a bit, you can see they've put up a board on a piece of wood saying music hall, because what Corcoran's account from the war tells us, and also kind of examples like this show us, is that prisoners of war had a whole own kind of connection and genre of their own musical performances and creating music and songs and singing of songs to kind of get through their experiences. Corcoran becomes the exemplar Irish volunteer who is sung about the most in the Civil War, even though he's not necessarily remembered as much as some other Irish American leaders in the 19th century. So him and Thomas Francis Meagher, a little bit of Patrick Claiborne in the South, if you know your Irish military leaders of the Civil War, they do get sung about, but they're always, it's their experiences, but also how the other Irish Americans should be adopting their stances, these selfless heroes on the battlefield. And so it's a good, they're kind of a running theme. In some ways, this book is also a semi-biography of Corcoran because of how much he appears. And one day that may be a book project further down the line. I'm a little bit still obsessed with him, even after all this time. Yeah, so this is an example I was saying about how there are also sometimes songs that produce the notations. These are much, much bigger. Song sheets are no bigger than about the palm of your hand. These are much kind of bigger pianoforte type music for the voice as well as for instrumentation. This is a song called Camp Song of the Irish Brigade, but the left-hand image is also its title cover, where it was called Camp Song of the Chicago Irish Brigade, and under their leader James Milligan. Now, there was no official Chicago Irish Brigade. There's only one official Union Army Irish Brigade, but this is an example about how a song can be written about one group and then slowly becomes about another, and then becomes more about the generic wider experience of the war. And so this one caused great footnoting hell about which version I was referring to, the Chicago one versus the kind of more general one that is sung about the Union Irish experience after 1863 or so. So it shows you that these are kind of other ways in which songs were disseminated and printed and published. And I can never get a good image of James Mulligan, so hence it's a bit fuzzy, but you can kind of get a kind of, all of them you notice get respectfully dedicated to people as well. There is also, and if you're familiar with any Irish American 19th century history, this one you might already know about, but there is also still latent anti-Irish nativism going on at the time of the Civil War. There are some scholars who kind of point out that the war actually lessened some of that than what popular memory would have us believe. But there are 4 different No Irish Need Apply songs. This rhetoric and slogan that gets echoed across the Atlantic. It comes from London originally, and then through the British Isles, and then across to America. It's very anti-Irish nativist sentiment. There are 4 versions that appear during the war that are actually specific No Irish Need Apply Civil War songs, and they talk a lot about the fact that their service is something to kind of be so praiseworthy. In other words, we're such good fighters, we show such loyal commitment to America, we want to keep the country together, that that you don't want us to not apply, you want us to apply. And there is one song that even suggests that the only people who should say no Irish need to apply are the Confederacy, because they're so terrified of facing Union Irish Americans on the battlefield. There's also What Irish Boys Can Do, which you can see with the subheading, no answer to No Irish Need Apply. So the Irish are using lots of these songs to also put across quite important political messages about their own standing within within America and within the battles, and they list there lots of their war service in that example on the left, as a sign of again, their absolute loyalty to the nation. This finally is my favorite of the Irish American songs that I've looked at. This is Pat Murphy of Mars Brigade, which is a very graphic song. If you can read the lyrics, it talks a lot about the fact that during the battle, it kind of describes the moment before camp, before battle in the camp, the night before. It's actually how the book starts. I use this song as a kind of running theme through the book, and how Pat Murphy is singing songs and everyone's in kind of nice, sort of calm. They're thinking about their loved ones. They're ready for battle. Then it goes into the battle and it becomes quite graphic about kind of holes through heads and bleeding and gory, and there's no censorship in lots of these songs. The Irish were not backwards about coming forwards when it came to kind of what they were experiencing on the battlefield. And then the end verse talks about the fact that the Irish will eventually go back to fight for freedom, but they ask for it with Columbia's help, and they start to use collective pronoun language, so kind of our and we, the Irish Americans, and that they won't do this alone as Irishmen, that they'll do this with the Americans, as Irish Americans will go back to fight. So Pat Murphy of Mars Brigade kind of actually became a good touch point through the book. It's like a good song that sums up lots of the different themes and messages. And then very finally, for the book, it concludes my actual main conclusion just touches a little bit about how lots of the same rhetoric could be heard in 1917 and the coming of the First World War. And this is an image from a songbook cover of 1917 with a St. Patrick's Day parade, where you can see both, again, the Harp of Erin and this flag of America, the Star Spangled Banner, coming together and uniting. I just thought it's an amazing image. It's a huge music score sheet that it is on. So that is kind of the book in a nutshell, a real nutshell. But I did want to finally, and I promised I would talk a little bit about kind of how all of this was done, because effectively and this is kind of advice, I write everything down. So I have loads of notes from old workshops and talks that were both run when I was at Edinburgh, but also I was lucky enough to be funded during the PhD. So my funders used to run workshops too. And we sat through loads of different talks about publishing, and I do strongly recommend that if they're ever offered to you, if you're doing a PhD, to definitely go to these talks and write these notes. But nothing quite will tell you what it's like until you actually go through the process yourself. So I finished my PhD in October. Well, was officially confirmed in October of 2018. And I went straight into 3 academic jobs in one term that year, and then 2 in the spring semester. So there was absolutely no time to really give much focus on the book. I knew I didn't really want to change too much of it though, partly because it was already quite a long PhD, and there was enough there. I did put some feelers out. I did send a proposal to one publisher and got rejected quite quickly, but they did offer kind of other suggestions. And so I spent quite a lot of the autumn term when I could and wasn't balancing all these jobs, basically compiling notes about what each press wanted, and particularly what each book series of presses wanted. Because while you may think, oh, this press would be perfect, if they don't have a series that's connected to what you want to write about, it's quite hard to get through. I knew that this was an American Civil War book. I've always, first and foremost, been an American Civil War historian. So I went after the kind of American Civil War series. So the image that you can see of the kind of different images that you can see on the screen, this under the submitting the proposal, this is LSU Press's guidelines for their particular book series about new dimensions in the Civil War. And so I basically went through that and kind of bullet pointed it, made it really quick about what I needed for each proposal. And I did this for about 9 different publishers to start off with, about what I was going to need to do for each one. And LSU was the one that I ranked them then about which one I wanted to do, and LSU came top on the list. So I sent off in late 2018, I think it was actually early 2019, sent off all the stuff that they asked for, and was amazed because this never came up in any of the workshops. So this is just a warning, was amazed that the first response I got back was, "This is great, can we see the whole book?" Because nobody had ever told me to have the whole book ready. That had never come up in any of the talks. And sometimes presses are different. But I went right back to LSU and said, it's not quite ready yet because it's still in kind of its PhD form. And they were amazing about giving me time then through the rest of 2019 to get it to them. So that did take a bit more time, but I was actually not expecting all that. And part of the reason I kept at it was that they were really keen and eager. They offered some suggestions about what could or couldn't go in. We had good kind of conversations about all of that. Eventually submitted it to them. It went to one reviewer, one very, 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 very dedicated reviewer, instead of 2, again, which is not what I was expecting. And got all of their notes back at the beginning of 2020, and then along came COVID. By this point, I was on to, I think, job number 5. So since 2018, I have worked at 6 institutions. I can see eyes shaking her head in despair. Yes, I've worked at 6 institutions. So I have done all of this, and this is the kind of point I wanted to make, and we can talk about this. I've done all this without any institutional support, partly because I've not been in any institution long enough on part-time contracts to be part of lots of that research culture. This is not, I'm not having a go at any of my lovely departments that I have worked in, or it's not aimed at that. It's more the fact that there has just not been the time or space to engage with all of that. And when you're there part-time, it also how much actually access to any of that you can get. So I literally relied on all of the notes that I had gathered from different workshops, and then just really excellent communication with LSU. And yes, I'm biased, but if you're thinking about doing stuff in American history or studies, LSU are amazingly communicative. They're really great the whole way through. They make the whole process really lovely because of the getting the edits back from the reviewer, or things to change from the reviewer, coincided with exactly the same time we pivoted online. They were amazing about giving me a few extra months to actually kind of work through this, while also trying to juggle the fact I was doing 2 jobs that were then all teaching online. That actually weirdly saved me some more time about the kind of process of stuff. Actually, at one point, this book could have come out in spring of 2022, but I wanted more time on it, and also because by that point we were very tired of what we were going through teaching wise, and so it's very hard and it can be very lonely. I think because I'd given loads of talks about my research through the PhD, I didn't really need to road test, or didn't feel the need to road test lots of these ideas. They'd already been out there in some shape or form through different public articles and also Bob pieces and stuff like that. So It is possible. I'm just going to say this. It is possible if you're juggling the short term and the precarious lifestyle. It is still possible to get the book out. You're just going to have to rely on your family for lots of support and cups of tea and talking through ideas in some way. And occasionally colleagues did ask me how things are going, but I wasn't around enough to see them or kind of build enough of a rapport. So in some ways, I do quite feel very defensive of this book in a way that it doesn't belong to any institution, because it belongs to me in some ways. And it also belongs to LSU in that they're the ones who have actually kind of picked up lots of the pieces where some people have a much kind of stronger relationship with institutions while they're working. So get to know your press. And if you've got a really good, if they're really enthusiastic from the start, which LSU were, then that bodes quite well for the rest of the process. And I think if they hadn't been, then I probably wouldn't be here with the book finished. It took about, so I finished in 2018, and then I got the contract in 2021, almost to the day of getting confirmed as a doctor. And then it came out a year later from the contract. So a lot of work was done before the contract came, but through the whole process, I knew the contract was coming. And so that also made me stick with LSU, in where others may go, actually, no, don't do this. So we can talk more about this in questions, because I'm sure that's possibly raised a lot of questions, but I'm just saying it is possible, but you just have to, I don't know, maybe I've just divided that to kind of slightly naive iron will after all these jobs and all these years of ad hoc teaching and publishing simultaneously. But it is possible, and it all really came down to the press, and that's what made it possible, and the amazing different editors and press. And so that's it for me. There's that image that I was referring to. You can just see the music hall reference at the back of that top image. And yes, I'm still just about on Twitter. I refuse to give in. And also there's my email address, or you can come find me and my fellow Irish and the American Civil War colleagues talking about Irish American stuff on Facebook and on our website. And I'll take any questions that you might have on any of that, including the publishing stuff. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. That is so fascinating and so detailed. It just shows how you can take a topic and run with it and create this whole universe out of it. I was very fascinated about the popular music or known tunes being used within it. So that was for me one of the most fascinating things. And I absolutely love how you said you're very proud of your book because it doesn't belong to any institution. So that's a beautiful thing to note as well. So yes, we're open for questions. Feel free to either type them in a chat or raise your hand. And while we're waiting, I could start with so how much do you think the music actually played a role in the creation of the lyrics? Was the music first or lyrics first? Because I know when I was teaching medieval lyric last semester, medieval lyric, and I played these songs for my students to kind of get a better interpretation and understand it, because even though the lyric could be sad, but the music was quite joyous, and vice versa, and how much that lent to the interpretation of them.
So I think a lot of them are written with the tunes in mind, or at least maybe in some cases they sometimes fit more than one tune. There is also, and I talk about this in the book too, about some of them are deliberately using what effectively have become American tunes by this point. So the Star Spangled Banner, as in the anthem, becomes a big thing that the Irish adopt quite early on. And the reason that's a little bit unusual is that the anthem is not set until 1931. So that's my quiz question that I always give to my students for you straight away. But also, actually, up until the Civil War, it's very rarely played outside of military settings because, and if you're watching, I don't want to talk about it because my team lost, but if you're watching the Super Bowl last night before it all went wrong, the anthem, I think the reason everyone was reacting to how beautifully played the anthem was last night is because it's really hard to sing to and play. And I know this from being in a university marching band too, that Americans rarely sing it because it's set in the wrong key. It's not meant to be sung the way Americans sing it. It's meant to be sung uproariously like they did in 1790s England. And so it's only really heard in military settings at flag lowering ceremonies or so on and so forth. The fact the Irish adopt it in the Civil War is because they get the fact that this is a song very much about America and identity that's written in 1814, and they really co-opt that. So they're kind of early adopters and part of the shift where that song becomes a bit more of a common tune through the rest end of the 19th century. There are other ones too, because there's about 5 or 6 de facto American anthems. There's never one, and lots of Irish tunes are set to those or variations of. So that music is quite important because it's again part of that American identity. They do also fall back on particular traditional tunes that are incredibly well known in America, and it's partly because they're well known. It's not because they're Irish. So there's one tune called the Irish Jaunting Car. It was written at the beginning of the 19th century, and it's in America in the 1850s, definitely, because there's lots of songs written about the Crimean War that cross over to the Atlantic. So the Americans would have known this tune very well. It's the tune, if you know your Confederate songs, it's the same tune that's used for the Bonnie Blue Flag, which is kind of the second anthem of the Confederacy. And the reason it's so well known is because it's just a very catchy earworm. It's like Dixie, which also itself is co-opted from different musical traditions. And so songwriters would fit it to a tune that's well known, because that the quicker you can learn a tune, even if you're illiterate, is if you set it to a tune that you know. It's how I used to learn A-level poems by William Blake, because we had to memorize them for exams, and I used to set them to kind of tunes as a way of helping. We just don't have that same skill set anymore because we're not used to consuming music in that same way. So yeah, tunes are doing both an identity thing when they're American, but also a familiarity, but also the quick dissemination thing, a kind of commercial thing when they're set to a well-known Irish traditional tune.
Brilliant, thank you. That, speaking of which, because they're so well, they were very, very prolific, weren't they, as well? They wrote, I believe you said in an interview, about 11,000 in a word, in a 4-year period.
Yeah.
So my curiosity is, did you also mentioned that they would get more graphic, like you said now as well, they would get more graphic as the war progressed as well. Yeah. So was there specific tropes that would come up the most that kind of caught your eye, that gave you kind of a running, because you had that one poem there you said you used kind of as a running thing throughout the book. So did you find it like running tropes that were more emphasized than others? Yeah,
so yes, during the year, you've been listening to my back catalogue very well. So there are 11,000 songs, it's estimated, actually just in general during the Civil War, and what we have is the archive of ephemera, so it's what survived effectively. But yes, there are some common themes that start to develop across the board, and the Irish are included in this. There is a slight turn by about 1863. The more sentimental songs come up, lots and lots of songs about mothers and vacant chairs that are kind of both sung on both sides of the divide. You don't see the same shift into anti-war that you do with First World War poetry, which was probably the most scale-wise comparable, but you do see a shift as the war goes on, in that more sentimental stuff comes out. There's no censorship, so although some songs are attempted to be banned, it's too late. Once a song is known, you can't actually ban it. Some more of the kind of gruesome ones about the kind of realities of war kick in. The Irish in particular seem to go down that route in some songs. You don't sometimes see it in other. German Americans don't tend to do that so much. Anything that's too much loss, or kind of the whole way through is still a kind of, we're going to keep this fight going, or the fight just becomes something bigger. So towards the end, as you get into 1865, songs start to talk a little bit more about reunion and reconciliation, not so much, but also about taking fights to elsewhere. There is one song that the Irish sing that includes a verse about how they're going to go off to fight Mormons in Salt Lake City, and then they're going to go and turn themselves on the Native Americans, and that's actually what a lot of the Irish who stayed in the army did. So that generates a whole different song connection as well. So there are some different themes. The battles stop being sung about quite so much. So actually the Vicksburg one I talked about is a rare example. After that, it slightly changes, and they just talk more broadly about the war. But there are some particular tropes that you can see across all Civil War songs.
Fabulous. Thank you. I can see we have a couple of questions in the chat. Thank you, Ben. So I'll just read that out for everyone. Thanks for this. The connection between music and war is really important. And this is a great piece of research. I 100% agree. It's fantastic. I'm interested if you know how Irish Civil War music was disseminated after the war, particularly outside of the United States. Did any of those songs find their way back to Ireland in any form?
Yeah, some of them did. So there are the ones that are written, like the one about Vicksburg, that are written at the time and are being published. There's also ones that are being published in the British Isles too. So both London and Liverpool publishers, of course, enclaves of Ireland, they are being produced during the conflict itself. And then some of them go back through performance, particularly the ones that lean slightly more to Irish nationalism. Bits of elements of those end up in balladry through the rest of the 19th century. Then more recently into the 20th century, some traditional Irish folk bands, so things like the Wolf Tones being probably the most famous, they do occasionally sing or have gone through Civil War songs and use them. Very early on, I had a decision to make in the PhD about whether or not to use those songs or not. And I took out references in this to the book so much, but there are albums from Irish singers and Irish American traditional singers, both sides of the Atlantic actually, who are singing Civil War songs and perform them. But they'll often alter some of the lyrics. They are sometimes a little bit, depending on when they're singing, a little bit more Republican leaning and nationalist, which they weren't in the originals, or they'll miss out the word. So any kind of collective sense, one of the chapters is a slight spoiler. Everyone should go get the book. It's available at all great bookshops, independent retailers and everything. The kind of the language of collectivism and the fact that actually they're singing about themselves as Americans that are in the original that I talk about in the book, they are missing in some of the more recent interpretations of it. And so there are a few kind of 20th century versions that aren't actually the original versions. And the musicology side of that says they're totally different songs. They're not the same song. This is usually the point where someone says, what about Gangs of New York? And there's a song in Gangs of New York that was not there in the 19th century. Or at least not in a Civil War, it's made up. So they're going back and being kind of co-opted for other causes, but that's almost another project that I would encourage somebody else to do.
Brilliant. It's always nice to see how one research brings more research, because all research is multidisciplinary at its core as well. There's always another aspect someone could look into.
Yeah.
Sean has also given us a question. So can you talk a little bit more about the instruments used to accompany these songs? What are the most common instruments, guitars or fiddles perhaps? And is there a sense that the instruments available shape the lyrics and melodies?
That's a really good, especially that second part of the question is really good. I've not seen anything where they're written particularly for certain instruments. There are some pianoforte amalgamations of different tunes that appear of lots of different Civil War tunes, not just Irish ones, sort of to perform war songs effectively in your parlor in the north. That definitely happens, but that's somebody else has effectively turned all of that into a different piece and combined it. You could easily fiddle and use kind of violin fiddling through lots of the songs because they're slightly written to kind of a martial beat, but you could easily add a kind of fiddle on over the top of it. There are definitely fiddles and guitars, and I find it's amazing that there are guitars in the camps. I include a story about one soldier who's asking for a guitar to be sent, or he's going to use some of his money to get a guitar. There's another story I've got of a soldier who's written to his sister to apologize for the fact that the money he's sending is not as much because he's used it to buy some sheet music and a violin, and it turns out it's because he and his sister used to perform in dance halls before the war, and so he just wants to keep up the practice. There are a couple of accounts of some drumming and piping that was going on a little bit, certainly between kind of families and brothers and fathers and sons who are on there. So there are instruments that are finding their way forward and backwards. What also, and the first couple of chapters deal with this too, is what's happening, and there have been other scholars who've written about this in relation to kind of more operatic music the kind of classical music then, is that a lot of that is starting to slowly disseminate into the middle classes and downwards then into the other kind of the musical culture as well. And so there are occasional kind of crossovers and transference of music and instruments and lyrics and so on and so forth. And so I talk a little bit about in the book how musical adverts inside classical, there's a journal called Dwight's Journal of Music, it's very famous in the 19th century. It starts to talk more about wartime songs and traditional music rather than just talking about classical operas in Europe. And so that instruments like that kind of change as well.
I think that nicely ties into how you said that there was a completely different type of musical literate communities in those days, which is not common in the same way at all nowadays. It was a lot more common for people to be able to play or sing or both.
Yeah, and it also fits in. So this is actually something that the reviewer picked up on, and I added in, which is that part of the reason actually lots of these songs are just adopted so much by Americans in the 19th century goes into a bigger theme that the reviewer picked out about the fact that Americans are already doing this with African American slave music and minstrelsy, and that's where that generation is coming from. And then at the same time, you also get the rise of the stereotypical stage Irish performances and Irish songs on the music, or what effectively but eventually becomes vaudeville, all very racist, all very xenophobic. But and I'm quite glad that the reviewer made me put this one in too, which is that the two things are running simultaneously, and it's all part of this wider amalgamation of different genres. They're not sort of dividers, you know, you have to just do class, you have classical is just for the upper classes, and so on and so forth. That there is a kind of mixing together of different traditions and things, and so yeah, your dance hall violinist could turn his hand to fiddling nice little tunes on the campfire effectively. The idea of bringing guitars onto the camp just when they're moving so much, that strikes me as nuts, but that's war. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, any relief really is, you know, there's the famous example, I think it was from the First World War, if I remember correctly, when the two sides had a Christmas break and had a football game between the trenches. So that, I mean, I guess it's any little bit of comfort you could bring.
Yeah, and there are stories, some of them are slightly apocryphal, but I also fully believe they happened as more than we know, where occasionally when they're close enough, especially during the Siege of Petersburg, so from 1864 to 65, there's this long siege, they're quite close to each other at certain times, where they kind of perform battle of the bands type moments where they're kind of mimicking each other. And because there is a trope and genre of songs that are almost identical to across each side, they're not changing them much, because there's lots of parody songs, there's lots of mocking of each other in songs, but they also share lots of songs too. And we know there are accounts of that going on as well, and a kind of and that's where instruments really kick in, and the military bands occasionally play across to each other, and there's, I don't really go into the full military music side because that's actually a whole other topic, with some Irish connections too, and that side of stuff, and how they're going around, they're disseminating lots of these songs too, but they're also talking to each other, of course, which is amazing, and shows that it's not quite as just binary as we think it is.
Things usually never are. If there's no other questions at the moment, I would like to kind of return to the publishing side of things. I had a couple thoughts that we could maybe talk about as well. So first of all, why American press?
So the very honest answer is pricing, which is that American presses tend to sell the books for far cheaper than what I've noticed in UK presses recently. There were a few on my kind of list, as I was saying, of going through different presses. There were a couple of UK presses who I'd either heard talk about from different kind of workshops or knew about. I'm not going to name names, but I noticed then friends and friends of friends who were publishing towards the back end of my PhD, and when they're selling at starting price of 120 to 170 pounds, it's not that if a library buys my book, that's brilliant, but it's more that I just thought, who on earth is going to buy this book? It's one of the reasons I keep saying yes to saying book reviews, is because it's free book effectively. So that was that actually a lot of the US presses, I mean, there are some US presses that will kind of charge upwards of $70 or so, but there are over Christmas, this book was at LSU had like 40% discount, I actually can't remember what the LSU starting price of, I think it's like $45 or so. It's actually relatively reasonable for an academic book, which means that it's more likely to get picked up and bought by presses, and it's more likely to send, and it's just more likely to get out there than there are so many friends' books that I would love to read but are just horrifically cost prohibitive. And so that was the biggest thing that turned me towards an American publisher. And then also I just felt a bit more comfortable with that they would understand where this book was actually designed to go to, with an American Civil War specific series, which lots of the US presses have.
That's an important kind of advice and information for all of us as well, considering being Americanists and being involved in American studies. It might be the best idea if you don't have the institutional support, which you mentioned before, to really start looking at the American ones and identifying those series or publishers that have published. Because one advice I've gotten over the years is, even if it's not a series, but if they publish a similar book or related to your book, they would be more keen to write, publish what you've done as well.
Yeah, and LSU, I mean, I do genuinely, I am biased, but LSU are amazing because they also publish a lot relating to the South and to Louisiana, and you think, oh, they're never going to want anything bigger, but they also have this whole other world of publishing that's throughout America and also international. And so in some ways, they just read through what they want, but then also put the feelers out a little bit. A lot of them also just send a proposal, and yeah, from that, the magic happens.
Great. I see Ben had a follow-up question. One other minor question. Is there such a thing as minor questions? Have any of these songs been absorbed into the modern US Armed Forces? You mentioned Irish adoption of Star Spangled Banner. Are there any others that find their way into the general military culture?
Yeah, so there are some remnants of, total restructuring, but certainly there's a Irish there's a 69th regiment that still knocks around that has quite strong Irish roots, and they have a song, their regimental song is called The Fighting Irish. Now, roots of that begin in the Civil War as well. The other one that some of you may know, especially if you've ever watched Westerns, is the tune Gary Owen, or the song Gary Owen. It gets adopted in the afterwar period by particularly during the American Indian Wars, but then also Custer and Sheridan and even Roosevelt and the Rough Riders start singing it. The Gary Owen's a really, really old tune, but that's an Irish song that's kind of actually got its own American military history identity. It only features as a cameo in the book. They surprisingly don't sing it very much during the war, or at least they don't publish about singing it very much during the Civil War, but then they do 10 years later when they're busy on their way to Little Bighorn, because there are Native American accounts of hearing this tune singing. And I read that was very early on in part of the PhD project, but that came out too because it became something different. But yeah, there are a couple that are kind of still casually floating around, in the same way that there are kind of Scottish American military roots too, from some of the groups like the 79th New Yorkers and their modern iterations.
Brilliant, thank you. Any other final questions? I'm conscious that we're drawing to an end of an hour. So if there's no pressing questions, any other last minute comments or recommendations from you, Catherine, for especially those of us, at the end stages or early career stages?
Yeah, and if anyone's got any questions about publishing or wants advice or anything, feel free to get in touch. I'm more than happy to pass on. But what helped not having an institution was the fact that I had notes from different workshops and different talks. The thing that came on quite late that no one ever talked about was about publicity, which is that some presses are better than others, and LSU are very, very good at publicity. And they put on the book series talks, and they have lots of attention on Facebook and Twitter. And they will retweet anything while we're still using it. And I know some US presses don't do that, or the LSU is slightly ahead of the game in that sense. So if anyone's got any kind of advice on that side about actually what do you then do afterwards, because it doesn't matter whether you're an institution or not at that point, it's also down to you and the publisher too. So put the feelers out, but also go with gut. And if you start talking to presses and they're really interested, then yeah, I would say go with them. But by all means, no, don't worry, Ben. I can see Ben's comment. I love the questions, Ben. Don't worry. Then please get in touch, and I'm more than happy to ask to give advice, because the more that you can go into this with advice, the better the whole process ends up being. And just don't be afraid to be honest with the press. through COVID, there were definite deadlines that were missed, and well, it was fine. The only ones that you can't miss are the copy editing ones, but you can be honest about that too. And I can give a whole other talk about indexing, but we won't talk about that too. But doing it on your own is painful.
Yeah, and I think there's also a lot to say, because you said you had you submitted a proposal and you quickly rejected. It's kind of not to give in as well, isn't that? Some of the famous books, whether academic or trade books in general, everyone's got a rejection at some point. It's just to keep going and keep refining that.
And that was tough, because that was for a series that was about military culture, which I had spent my 4 years of the PhD being like, that's what this book is. It's military culture of the Civil War. And to be told that it was no, I was a bit like, oh, what's my identity? But yeah, that actually helped, because they were also great, because they gave 2 other options, one which was on my list, so it proved that I was thinking the wrong way, and the other one which I hadn't thought about, but actually is a really fantastic press, and I know lots of good publishing stuff from there too. So yeah, by any all means, anyone wants to get in touch with me about any of that, I'm more than happy to pass on my wisdom.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I would like to thank you for today. That's been a great presentation and just a great chat in general about publishing and about this unique culture. And I loved how you said cultural consequences, which is a lot of what those questions were about as well, the cultural consequences. So it's very, very interesting. So thank you. Hopefully we'll get to talk to you again soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Everyone's slowly departing.
I can comment.
I think, Robin, you can stop the recording there as well.